Between 1954 and 1975, the United States fought two wars at once and lost neither of them entirely, and won neither of them cleanly either. At home, Black Americans fought a sustained, dangerous campaign against legal segregation, a fight that produced genuine, historic legislative victories and cost real people their lives along the way. Abroad, American troops fought a war in Vietnam that the government could never fully explain, could never convincingly win, and eventually could not persuade its own citizens to keep supporting. These two conflicts ran side by side for the exact same 21 years, and they shaped each other constantly. This video covers the whole thematic arc every exam board sets: how the civil rights movement actually won its victories, why Vietnam actually went so badly, and how protest at home and war abroad kept colliding, again and again. Let's start with the legal system civil rights activists were actually up against. By 1954, Black Americans across the southern United States lived under Jim Crow laws, a comprehensive legal system of racial segregation covering schools, transport, restaurants, and public facilities of every kind. The Supreme Court had upheld this system back in 1896 in the case Plessy v. Ferguson, ruling that segregated facilities were constitutionally acceptable so long as they remained separate but equal. In grim, unmistakable practice, Black schools, Black hospitals, and Black neighborhoods were consistently, deliberately underfunded compared to white ones, and Black voters across the South faced deliberate, systematic obstacles, poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright, violent intimidation that kept actual voter registration rates artificially, dramatically low. The Ku Klux Klan and other openly violent groups enforced this entire system with real, terrifying impunity, and local police forces frequently did nothing whatsoever to stop them. This was the legal and social structure the civil rights movement had to dismantle, piece by piece, over the following 2 decades. On the 17th of May 1954, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, directly overturning the separate but equal precedent that had stood for 58 straight years. The ruling was, on paper, an enormous, sweeping legal victory, and it gave the entire civil rights movement genuine legal momentum to build directly on. But the exam-relevant catch matters enormously. Brown ordered desegregation to proceed with, in the court's own carefully vague phrase, all deliberate speed, and many southern states interpreted that specific phrase as license for years, even decades of open, deliberate delay and outright, defiant resistance. Some southern school districts genuinely remained segregated well into the 1970s, over 15 years after the ruling. Brown proved a crucial legal foundation and a genuinely inadequate practical solution, entirely on its own, and it's exactly this specific gap, between the law on paper and the reality on the ground, that the movement now had to force open. In August 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till, visiting relatives in Mississippi from Chicago, was brutally murdered by 2 white men after being accused, on flimsy, disputed grounds, of whistling at a white woman in a local store. His murderers were tried and, before an all-white jury, acquitted within barely an hour of deliberation. Till's mother, Mamie Till Mobley, made an extraordinarily brave, deliberate decision. She insisted on an open casket at his funeral, specifically so the whole country could see exactly what had been done to her son. Photographs of his mutilated body were published in Black newspapers and magazines nationwide, and the case became a genuine national catalyst, galvanizing outrage and organizing energy across Black communities throughout the entire country. Rosa Parks herself later said she was thinking specifically of Emmett Till on the day, just months later, that she refused to give up her own bus seat in Montgomery, Alabama. On the 1st of December 1955, Rosa Parks, a Black seamstress and experienced local civil rights activist, refused to give up her bus seat to a white passenger in Montgomery, Alabama, and was arrested for violating the city's segregation laws. Montgomery's Black community, coordinated through local church networks, responded with a sustained, remarkably disciplined boycott of the entire city bus system, organizing elaborate carpools and simply walking, in enormous numbers, rather than ride segregated buses. The boycott lasted 381 consecutive days, inflicting real, serious, sustained financial damage on the bus company itself. A relatively unknown 26-year-old Baptist minister named Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as the boycott's primary public spokesman and leader during this exact campaign. In November 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that Montgomery's segregated bus seating was unconstitutional. It was the movement's first major, sustained, genuinely decisive victory, and it announced Martin Luther King to the entire nation. In September 1957, 9 black students, now remembered as the Little Rock Nine, attempted to enroll at the previously all-white Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, directly enforcing the Brown ruling 3 years after it had actually been decided. Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus deployed the state's own National Guard, not to protect the students, but specifically to physically block them from entering the school building at all. Furious white mobs gathered outside, and the resulting crisis drew intense national and genuinely international media attention. President Eisenhower, forced to act by the sheer scale of the defiance, federalized the Arkansas National Guard and deployed United States Army troops specifically to escort and protect the 9 students into the school itself. It was a genuinely landmark moment, the first time since the post-Civil War Reconstruction era that federal troops had been sent into the South specifically to enforce Black Americans' basic constitutional rights. In 1957, Martin Luther King and other Black church leaders founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, to coordinate civil rights activity in a genuinely organized, sustained way right across the South. King's core strategy centered on nonviolent direct action, deliberately, carefully influenced by Mahatma Gandhi's independence campaign in India, peaceful protests, marches, and boycotts, undertaken with full knowledge that they would likely provoke a violent response from segregationist authorities. This was never passivity, it was calculated, disciplined political strategy. Televised images of peaceful, well-dressed, nonviolent protesters being attacked, beaten, or arrested by police proved to be an exceptionally powerful tool for winning over sympathetic public opinion, especially in the North and among moderate white Americans who had previously stayed largely disengaged from the whole issue. Nonviolence deployed this deliberately forced segregationist violence into full, undeniable public view for the entire watching country to see for themselves on the evening news. In February 1960, 4 Black college students sat down at a segregated lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and simply refused to leave when denied service, sparking a wave of similar sit-ins that spread rapidly to dozens of other southern cities within weeks. In 1961, mixed-race groups of activists called Freedom Riders boarded interstate buses specifically to test a recent Supreme Court ruling that had already banned segregation on interstate travel. They were met with real, serious, sometimes life-threatening violence. Mobs in Alabama firebombed one bus entirely and viciously beat riders as they attempted to escape the flames. These specific campaigns showed a deliberate generational and tactical shift already emerging within the wider movement. Younger activists, often organized through the new Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, were increasingly willing to directly, physically confront segregation themselves, rather than simply wait patiently for slower legal or legislative change to eventually arrive on its own. In spring 1963, the SCLC targeted Birmingham, Alabama, one of the most rigidly, notoriously segregated cities anywhere in the entire South, with a sustained, carefully organized campaign of marches, sit-ins, and business boycotts. When adult participation began to noticeably slow, organizers made a genuinely controversial decision, recruiting schoolchildren, some as young as 6 years old, to march in what became known as the Children's Crusade. Birmingham's police commissioner, Eugene Bull Connor, ordered officers to turn high-pressure fire hoses and trained police dogs directly on the peaceful young marchers. Photographs and television footage of children being blasted off their feet by fire hoses and attacked by police dogs shocked the entire watching world and generated overwhelming, sustained international sympathy and outrage. The Birmingham campaign is widely considered a decisive, genuinely crucial turning point, one that finally pushed President Kennedy to publicly announce comprehensive new civil rights legislation just weeks later, that same summer. On the 28th of August 1963, roughly 250,000 people gathered peacefully in Washington, D.C., for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the largest civil rights demonstration the United States had ever witnessed up to that point. The march deliberately, strategically combined civil rights demands with genuine economic justice demands, explicitly highlighting persistent, structural Black poverty and unemployment alongside legal segregation itself. At the Lincoln Memorial, Martin Luther King delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech, articulating a powerful, hopeful vision of full, genuine racial equality that remains among the most quoted speeches in the whole of American history to this day. The march was disciplined, entirely peaceful, and extensively covered by television networks right across the whole country. It created real, sustained, undeniable political momentum that fed directly into the Civil Rights Act the following year, demonstrating decisively that peaceful mass protest, deployed at genuinely enormous scale, could shift national political conversation in ways smaller, more localized actions simply could not manage alone. President Lyndon Johnson, who took office after Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, made passing comprehensive civil rights legislation a genuine personal political priority and signed the Civil Rights Act into law in July 1964. The act banned discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin across public accommodations, employment, and any federally funded program or institution whatsoever. It represented the most significant, most comprehensive piece of civil rights legislation passed by Congress since the Reconstruction era, immediately following the American Civil War, nearly a full century earlier. But the exam-relevant limitation matters just as much here as the genuine achievement itself. The act addressed legal segregation directly, but it did comparatively little to immediately, practically tackle voting rights specifically, or the entrenched economic inequality that continued to affect Black communities right across the entire country, North and South alike. One enormous, foundational legal barrier had genuinely fallen. Several others, just as significant, still stood firmly in place. In March 1965, civil rights activists organized a march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, specifically to protest the systematic, deliberate obstruction of Black voter registration that persisted across the South despite the Civil Rights Act's passage the previous year. On the 7th of March, state troopers and local police brutally attacked peaceful marchers as they attempted to cross Selma's Edmund Pettus Bridge, an event immediately, permanently remembered as Bloody Sunday. Television networks broadcast the violence nationwide that same evening, and the resulting public outrage proved genuinely decisive. President Johnson addressed Congress directly, explicitly invoking the movement's own rallying cry, "We shall overcome," and pushed hard for immediate new legislation. The Voting Rights Act, signed into law in August 1965, banned the literacy tests and other discriminatory practices that had long, deliberately suppressed Black voter registration, and it placed federal oversight directly over election procedures in states with a documented, proven history of racial discrimination at the ballot box. Not every Black American leader agreed with King's specific strategy of nonviolent integration into existing American society. Malcolm X, a minister with the Nation of Islam, argued forcefully for Black self-reliance, self-defense, and, for much of his public career, separation rather than integration, and his uncompromising, confrontational speeches drew huge, enthusiastic crowds specifically in northern cities, where Black communities already held the legal right to vote but still faced grinding poverty and openly discriminatory policing every single day. In 1964, after a genuinely transformative pilgrimage to Mecca, where he prayed directly alongside Muslims of every different race, Malcolm X publicly broke from the Nation of Islam and began cautiously, publicly reconsidering some of his own earlier, more separatist positions. He was assassinated in February 1965 by former Nation of Islam associates while giving a public speech in New York. His life, and his particular critique of King's more gradualist approach, directly anticipated the more radical Black Power movement that followed closely behind him. By the mid-1960s, a genuinely new political current, Black Power, gained real, sustained momentum, particularly among younger Black activists who felt that legal desegregation alone had done comparatively little to actually address deep, entrenched economic inequality or the frequent, everyday reality of police brutality. The Black Panther Party, founded in Oakland, California in 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, openly, publicly advocated armed self-defense against police brutality specifically, while also running genuinely successful, popular community programs, including free breakfast schemes for school children and neighborhood health clinics. Mainstream American media coverage focused overwhelmingly on the Panthers' weapons and their openly militant public rhetoric, largely overlooking or ignoring their extensive, genuinely valued social welfare work within their own communities. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, treated the Black Power movement broadly as a serious, direct domestic security threat and actively worked, through covert surveillance and direct infiltration, to systematically undermine and disrupt it from within. Vietnam had been divided in 1954 following France's own defeat as a colonial power there into a communist North under Ho Chi Minh and a nominally independent, American-backed South. American policymakers, deeply shaped by Cold War thinking, embraced what became known as the domino theory, the specific, genuinely widely held fear that if Vietnam fell to communism, neighboring Southeast Asian countries would swiftly follow it, one after another, like a row of falling dominoes. What looked from Washington like a critical Cold War battleground was, to a great many ordinary Vietnamese people themselves, substantially a civil war and a genuine, long-standing independence struggle against foreign, external control, first French and now, increasingly, American. This fundamental mismatch in basic understanding, a global ideological contest for American policymakers, a national struggle for independence and self-determination for many Vietnamese, sits right at the very root of why American strategy in Vietnam repeatedly, persistently struggled to actually work as intended. American involvement in Vietnam began modestly and grew steadily, well before the war most people picture today. Under President Eisenhower, the United States provided South Vietnam with financial aid and a modest number of military advisors. President Kennedy expanded that advisory role substantially, increasing troop numbers into the thousands specifically to train and directly support South Vietnamese forces, without formally, officially committing American combat troops to direct fighting. South Vietnam's own government, meanwhile, proved chronically unstable and was frequently, genuinely unpopular with large sections of its own population, hampered by serious, persistent corruption and a series of military coups. American policymakers found themselves repeatedly propping up a South Vietnamese government that could not reliably, sustainably win the genuine loyalty of its own citizens, a fundamental, structural weakness that no amount of purely American military support could realistically fix on its own, no matter how much money or manpower was eventually committed to the effort. In August 1964, the American destroyer USS Maddox reported being attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. A second, reported follow-up attack days later remains genuinely disputed by historians to this day, with considerable evidence suggesting it may never have actually happened at all. President Johnson nonetheless requested, and Congress overwhelmingly approved, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting the president sweeping, essentially open-ended authority to take whatever direct military action he personally judged necessary in Southeast Asia, without any further, separate formal declaration of war required from Congress. It represents a genuinely crucial exam turning point, the specific moment American involvement shifted decisively from advising and training South Vietnamese forces toward direct, large-scale American combat operations of its own. Within months, American ground troops were deployed to Vietnam in genuinely large, rapidly escalating numbers, and the fundamentally uncertain, contested factual basis for that whole escalation would later provoke real, lasting controversy back home. American troop numbers in Vietnam climbed dramatically and rapidly under President Johnson, from roughly 23,000 in 1964 to well over 500,000 by 1968. Most of these soldiers were young draftees, selected through compulsory military conscription, and the exam-relevant social detail matters enormously here. Draft deferments were considerably easier to obtain for university students, and the comparatively wealthy, meaning working-class and Black American men, were consistently, disproportionately drafted and sent to fight and die in Vietnam at genuinely higher rates than their wealthier, better-connected peers. Fighting itself proved to be brutal, exhausting jungle warfare against an elusive, highly mobile Viet Cong enemy who deliberately avoided large, conventional set-piece battles wherever realistically possible, instead relying heavily on ambush tactics, extensive tunnel networks, and sustained, patient guerrilla warfare. American technological and firepower superiority, though genuinely real and substantial on paper, repeatedly, persistently struggled to convert into any kind of clear, lasting, sustainable strategic advantage on the actual ground. Vietnam's dense jungle terrain, combined with the Viet Cong's deliberate guerrilla tactics, made this an exceptionally difficult war for conventional American military methods to fight effectively at all. There was frequently no clear, stable front line whatsoever, and American soldiers could face a genuine ambush literally anywhere at any time from an enemy who then simply melted straight back into the dense surrounding jungle or, in many cases, directly into ordinary local civilian villages themselves. The United States deployed napalm, an intensely flammable incendiary weapon, and Agent Orange, a toxic chemical herbicide sprayed extensively to strip away protective jungle cover, both of which caused severe, lasting, well-documented harm to Vietnamese civilians and, eventually, to American soldiers themselves. Distinguishing genuine Viet Cong combatants from ordinary civilians proved consistently, dangerously difficult in day-to-day practice, and this fundamental, persistent uncertainty contributed directly to civilian casualties and, as the next beat shows in stark, specific, disturbing detail, to real documented atrocities. In January 1968, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched a massive, coordinated surprise offensive during Tet, the Vietnamese New Year holiday, striking more than 100 cities and military targets right across South Vietnam simultaneously, including a direct, symbolically devastating attack on the American embassy compound itself in Saigon. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was, in fact, a clear, decisive defeat for North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. American and South Vietnamese forces ultimately repelled the attacks and inflicted genuinely heavy losses on the attackers. But the exam-relevant point here matters enormously, and it's frequently misunderstood. Tet proved to be a devastating psychological and political victory for the North regardless, because American television audiences had been repeatedly, confidently told the war was already being won, and Tet visibly, undeniably proved otherwise live on the evening news. Public and even elite political confidence in the war's basic trajectory collapsed sharply and rapidly in its immediate aftermath, and President Johnson would soon announce he would not seek re-election that same year. In March 1968, American soldiers entered the village of My Lai, having been wrongly, mistakenly informed it was a Viet Cong stronghold, and murdered more than 500 unarmed Vietnamese civilians, including women, children, and elderly villagers, over the course of just a few sustained, horrifying hours. The massacre was initially deliberately covered up by military commanders, and it only became public knowledge over a year later, in November 1969, when investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published detailed, corroborated accounts based on soldiers' own direct testimony. Photographs of the massacre's victims, once finally published, shocked the American public profoundly and deeply. Only one soldier, Lieutenant William Calley, was ever actually convicted for the massacre, and he ultimately served just over 3 years under comfortable house arrest before being released. My Lai became a genuinely powerful, devastating symbol for the growing American anti-war movement. Unmistakable, undeniable proof that the war was inflicting real, severe, indiscriminate harm on the very Vietnamese civilians it claimed to be protecting from communism. As the war dragged on with mounting American casualties and no clear, credible end in convincing sight, opposition grew steadily and substantially at home, especially among university students directly facing the draft themselves. Protests grew dramatically in both scale and frequency. Campus demonstrations, large public draft card burnings, and, in October 1967, a march of roughly 100,000 protesters directly on the Pentagon itself in Washington. Coverage of the war on television, often remembered as America's first genuinely televised war, brought graphic combat footage directly into millions of ordinary American living rooms most nights, steadily eroding the comfortable distance between the war itself and ordinary civilian daily life back home. The anti-war movement was never remotely unified in outlook. It included pacifists on straightforward moral grounds, students specifically motivated by their own personal draft eligibility, and civil rights activists who argued, forcefully and pointedly, that the war disproportionately drafted and killed poor and Black American men while comprehensively draining resources away from urgently needed domestic anti-poverty programs at home. In May 1970, President Nixon announced American forces were expanding operations into neighboring Cambodia, directly widening the war rather than the steady withdrawal many war-weary Americans had, by this point, been genuinely expecting. Protests erupted immediately on university campuses right across the entire country, Kent State University in Ohio among them. On the 4th of May 1970, Ohio National Guard troops opened fire directly on unarmed student protesters at Kent State, killing 4 students outright and wounding 9 others, one of whom was left permanently paralyzed as a direct result. The shootings shocked the entire nation and triggered a genuinely massive nationwide student strike, involving several million students and forcing hundreds of American colleges and universities to close down completely, some for the remainder of that entire academic year. Kent State demonstrated, in the starkest, most brutal possible terms, just how deeply, how dangerously divided American society itself had become over the war by this specific point. Facing sustained, overwhelming domestic pressure to end the war, President Nixon introduced a policy known as Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing American ground troops while simultaneously transferring primary responsibility for the actual fighting back to South Vietnamese forces themselves, alongside continued, and in some periods substantially intensified, American bombing campaigns from the air. American troop numbers fell steadily and substantially from their 1968 peak, and domestic protests correspondingly eased somewhat as the direct draft burden on ordinary American families gradually lightened. But South Vietnamese forces, despite years of American training, equipment, and advisory support, still struggled to operate independently and effectively without direct American ground support standing right behind them. Vietnamization succeeded reasonably well at the specific, narrower goal of reducing American casualties and domestic political pressure, but it never remotely resolved the war's deeper underlying structural problem, a South Vietnamese government and army that still could not reliably sustain themselves, militarily or politically, entirely without direct, extensive American backing. The Paris Peace Accords, signed in January 1973, formally ended direct American combat involvement in Vietnam, and the last American combat troops withdrew shortly afterward. Fighting between North and South Vietnam, however, continued without any real pause whatsoever. In April 1975, North Vietnamese forces captured Saigon, the South Vietnamese capital, in what became universally known as the Fall of Saigon. American helicopters conducted a chaotic, now iconic mass evacuation from rooftops across the city, airlifting American personnel and thousands of desperate South Vietnamese allies to safety in barely 18 frantic hours. Vietnam was reunified almost immediately under communist rule. More than 58,000 American soldiers had died in the war, alongside a genuinely staggering, still debated number of Vietnamese deaths. Credible estimates run into the several millions, when North and South Vietnamese military and civilian casualties are all properly, honestly counted together. The very domino theory that had originally justified American involvement never actually materialized as predicted anywhere else in the wider region. So, pulling both halves of this story together for the exam hall, the civil rights movement won genuine, durable, historic legislative victories, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the formal, comprehensive dismantling of legal segregation through a carefully calculated, genuinely effective combination of nonviolent direct action, sympathetic mass media coverage, and sustained, patient political pressure applied over more than a decade. Vietnam, running across the exact same period, ended in comprehensive American strategic failure, undermined by a fundamental, foundational misreading of Vietnamese nationalism as simply Cold War communism, by an unreliable South Vietnamese ally, and eventually, decisively, by the complete collapse of sustained domestic American political support for the war itself. Both stories, civil rights and Vietnam, also directly, profoundly shaped each other throughout. Draft inequality fed civil rights arguments about the war directly, and television coverage of both movements taught an entire generation of ordinary Americans to watch their own government's actions with real, lasting, hard-won skepticism. That is the USA, 1954 to 1975, the whole conflict at home and abroad every exam board expects you to know. Brown versus Board and Emmett Till, Montgomery and Little Rock, Birmingham and the March on Washington, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, running directly alongside the Gulf of Tonkin, the Tet Offensive, My Lai, Kent State, Vietnamization, and the Fall of Saigon. If you remember one single framework walking into that exam hall, remember this. Nonviolent, disciplined protest combined with sympathetic, widespread media coverage could genuinely, measurably move American public opinion and American law, and that exact same media coverage could also, just as powerfully, turn that same public decisively against an unwinnable, unpopular war fought thousands of miles from home. Both of America's defining conflicts of this specific era were fought as much on ordinary living room television screens as anywhere else. This video is part of our GCSE History playlist. Subscribe and good luck in that exam hall.